Theme 6. Bhakti, Sufi traditions. Changes in religious beliefs and devotional texts. Theme 6. Bhakti, Sufi traditions. Changes in religious beliefs and devotional texts c. 8th to 18th century. We saw in chapter 4 that by the mid-first millennium the landscape of the subcontinent was dotted with a variety of religious structures, stupas, monasteries, temples. If these typified certain religious beliefs and practices, others have been reconstructed from textual traditions, including the Puranas, many of which received their present shape around the same time, and yet others remain only faintly visible in textual and visual records. Fic. 6.18 12th century bronze sculpture of Manikkavachakar, a devotee of Shiva who composed beautiful devotional songs in Tamil. New textual sources available from this period include compositions attributed to poet saints, most of whom expressed themselves orally in regional languages used by ordinary people. These compositions, which were often set to music, were compiled by disciples or devotees, generally after the death of the poet saint. What is more, these traditions were fluid. Generations of devotees tended to elaborate on the original message, and occasionally modified or even abandoned some of the ideas that appeared problematic or irrelevant in different political, social or cultural contexts. Using these sources thus poses a challenge to historians. Historians also draw on hagiographies or biographies of saints written by their followers or members of their religious sect. These may not be literally accurate, but allow a glimpse into the ways in which devotees perceive the lives of these path-breaking women and men. As we will see, these sources provide us with insights into a scenario characterized by dynamism and diversity. Let us look at some elements of these more closely. 1. A mosaic of religious beliefs and practices. Perhaps the most striking feature of this phase is the increasing visibility of a wide range of gods and goddesses in sculpture as well as in texts. At one level, this indicates the continued and even extended worship of the major deities Vishnu, Shiva and the goddess, each of whom was visualized in a variety of forms. 1.1 The integration of cults. Historians who have tried to understand these developments suggest that there were at least two processes at work. One was a process of disseminating Brahmanical ideas. This is exemplified by the composition, compilation and preservation of Puranic texts in simple Sanskrit verse, explicitly meant to be accessible to women and Shudras, who were generally excluded from Vedic learning. At the same time, there was a second process at work, that of the Brahmanas accepting and reworking the beliefs and practices of these and other social categories. In fact, many beliefs and practices were shaped through a continuous dialogue between what sociologists have described as great Sanskritic Puranic traditions and little traditions throughout the land. One of the most striking examples of this process is evident at Puri, Orissa, where the principal deity was identified, by the 12th century, as Jagannatha, literally, the Lord of the world, a form of Vishnu. Great and little traditions. The terms great and little traditions were coined by a sociologist named Robert Redfield in the 20th century to describe the cultural practices of peasant societies. He found that peasants observed rituals and customs that emanated from dominant social categories, including priests and rulers. These he classified as part of a great tradition. At the same time, peasants also followed local practices that did not necessarily correspond with those of the great tradition. These he included within the category of little tradition. He also noticed that both great and little traditions changed over time, through a process of interaction. While scholars accept the significance of these categories and processes, they are often uncomfortable with the hierarchy suggested by the terms great and little. The use of quotation marks for great and little is one way of indicating this. Fic. 6.2 Jagannatha extreme right, with his sister Subhadra center, and his brother Balarama. If you compare Fic. 6.2 with Fic. 4.26 chapter 4, you will notice that the deity is represented in a very different way. In this instance, a local deity, whose image was and continues to be made of wood by local tribal specialists, was recognized as a form of Vishnu. At the same time, Vishnu was visualized in a way that was very different from that in other parts of the country. Such instances of integration are evident amongst goddess cults as well. Worship of the goddess, often simply in the form of a stone smeared with ochre, was evidently widespread. These local deities were often incorporated within the Puranic framework by providing them with an identity as a wife of the principal male deities. Sometimes they were equated with Lakshmi, the wife of Vishnu. In other instances, with Parvati, the wife of Shiva. 1.2 Difference and conflict. Often associated with the goddess were forms of worship that were classified as tantric. Tantric practices were widespread in several parts of the subcontinent. They were open to women and men, and practitioners often ignored differences of caste and class within the ritual context. Many of these ideas influenced Shaivism as well as Buddhism, especially in the eastern, northern and southern parts of the subcontinent. Fic. 6.3 Sculpture of a Buddhist Goddess, Marichi, c. 10th century. Bihar, an example of the process of integration of different religious beliefs and practices. All of these somewhat divergent and even disparate beliefs and practices would come to be classified as Hindu over the course of the next millennium. The divergence is perhaps most stark if we compare Vedic and Puranic traditions. The principal deities of the Vedic pantheon, Agni, Indra and Soma, become marginal figures, rarely visible in textual or visual representations. And while we can catch a glimpse of Vishnu, Shiva and the goddess in Vedic mantras, these have little in common with the elaborate Puranic mythologies. However, in spite of these obvious discrepancies, the Vedas continued to be revered as authoritative. Not surprisingly, there were sometimes conflicts as well. Those who valued the Vedic tradition often condemned practices that went beyond the closely regulated contact with the divine through the performance of sacrifices or precisely chanted mantras. On the other hand, those engaged in tantric practices frequently ignored the authority of the Vedas. Also, devotees often tended to project their chosen deity, either Vishnu or Shiva, as supreme. Relations with other traditions, such as Buddhism or Jainism, were also often fraught with tension if not open conflict. The traditions of devotion or bhakti need to be located within this context. Devotional worship had a long history of almost 1,000 years before the period we are considering. During this time, expressions of devotion ranged from the routine worship of deities within temples to ecstatic adoration where devotees attained a trance-like state. The singing and chanting of devotional compositions was often a part of such modes of worship. This was particularly true of the Vaishnava and Shaiva sects. Discuss. Find out about gods and goddesses worshipped in your town or village, noting their names and the ways in which they are depicted. Describe the rituals that are performed. 2. Poems of prayer. Early traditions of Bhakti. In the course of the evolution of these forms of worship, in many instances, poet saints emerged as leaders around whom there developed a community of devotees. Further, while Brahmanas remained important intermediaries between gods and devotees in several forms of bhakti, these traditions also accommodated and acknowledged women and the lower castes, categories considered ineligible for liberation within the orthodox Brahmanical framework. What also characterized traditions of bhakti was a remarkable diversity. At a different level, historians of religion often classify bhakti traditions into two broad categories: saguna with attributes, and nirguna without attributes. The former included traditions that focused on the worship of specific deities such as Shiva, Vishnu and his avatars incarnations, and forms of the goddess or Devi, all often conceptualized in anthropomorphic forms. Nirguna bhakti, on the other hand, was worship of an abstract form of God. 2.1 The Alvas and Nainas of Tamil Nadu. Some of the earliest bhakti movements, c. 6th century, were led by the Alvas, literally, those who are immersed in devotion to Vishnu, and Nainas, literally, leaders who were devotees of Shiva. They traveled from place to place singing hymns in Tamil in praise of their gods. Source 1. The Chaturvedin Brahmana versed in the four Vedas, and the outcast. This is an excerpt from a composition of an Alvar named Tondaradipodi, who was a Brahmana. Yuk Vishnu. Manifestly like those servants who express their love for your feet, though they may be born outcasts, more than the Chaturvedins who are strangers and without allegiance to your service. Do you think Tondaradipodi was opposed to the caste system? Source 2. Shastras or devotion. This is a verse composed by Akbar, a Nanar saint. O rogues who quote the law books, of what use are your gotra and cooler? Just bow to Marperu's Lord Shiva, who resides in Marperu, in Thanjavur, Tamil Nadu, as your sole refuge. Are there any similarities or differences in the attitudes of Tondaradipodi and Akbar towards Brahmanas? During their travels, the Alvas and Nainas identified certain shrines as abodes of their chosen deities. Very often large temples were later built at these sacred places. These developed as centers of pilgrimage. Singing compositions of these poet saints became part of temple rituals in these shrines, as did worship of the saints' images. 2.2 Attitudes towards caste. Some historians suggest that the Alvas and Nainas initiated a movement of protest against the caste system and the dominance of Brahmanas, or at least attempted to reform the system. To some extent, this is corroborated by the fact that Bhaktas hailed from diverse social backgrounds ranging from Brahmanas to artisans and cultivators, and even from castes considered untouchable. The importance of the traditions of the Alvas and Nainas was sometimes indicated by the claim that their compositions were as important as the Vedas. For instance, one of the major anthologies of compositions by the Alvas, the Nalaira Divyaprabandham, was frequently described as the Tamil Veda, thus claiming that the text was as significant as the four Vedas in Sanskrit that were cherished by the Brahmanas. 2.3 Women devotees. Perhaps one of the most striking features of these traditions was the presence of women. For instance, the compositions of Indal, a woman Alvar, were widely sung and continue to be sung to date. Indal saw herself as the beloved of Vishnu. Her verses express her love for the deity. Another woman, Karetkal Ammayar, a devotee of Shiva, adopted the path of extreme asceticism in order to attain her goal. Her compositions were preserved within the Naina tradition. These women renounced their social obligations, but did not join an alternative order or become nuns. Their very existence and their compositions posed a challenge to patriarchal norms. Compilations of devotional literature. By the 10th century, the compositions of the 12 Alvas were compiled in an anthology known as the Nalaira Divyaprabandham, 4,000 sacred compositions. The poems of Akbar, Sambinder and Sundarar form the Tevaram, a collection that was compiled and classified in the 10th century on the basis of the music of the songs. Source 3. A Demon. This is an excerpt from a poem by Karaikal Ammayar in which she describes herself. The female demoness, with bulging veins, protruding eyes, white teeth and shrunken stomach, red hair and jutting teeth, lengthy shins extending till the ankles, shouts and wails. Fic. 6.48 12th century bronze image of Karaikal Ammayar. While wandering in the forest. This is the forest of Alankattu, which is the home of our father Shiva, who dances with his matted hair thrown in all 8 directions and with cool limbs. List the ways in which Karaikal Ammayar depicts herself as presenting a contrast to traditional notions of feminine beauty. 2.4 Relations with the state. We saw in chapter 2 that there were several important chiefdoms in the Tamil region in the early 1st millennium c. From the second half of the 1st millennium there is evidence for states, including those of the Pallavas and Pandyas c. 6th to 9th centuries c. While Buddhism and Jainism had been prevalent in this region for several centuries, drawing support from merchant and artisan communities, these religious traditions received occasional royal patronage. Interestingly, one of the major themes in Tamil Bhakti hymns is the poet's opposition to Buddhism and Jainism. This is particularly marked in the compositions of the Niners. Historians have attempted to explain this hostility by suggesting that it was due to competition between members of other religious traditions for royal patronage. What is evident is that the powerful Chola rulers 9th to 13th centuries supported Brahmanical and Bhakti traditions, making land grants and constructing temples for Vishnu and Shiva. In fact, some of the most magnificent Shiva temples, including those at Chidambaram, Thanjavur and Gangaikonda Cholapuram, were constructed under the patronage of Chola rulers. This was also the period when some of the most spectacular representations of Shiva in bronze sculpture were produced. Clearly, the visions of the Niners inspired artists. Both Niners and Alvas were revered by the Velala peasants. Not surprisingly, rulers tried to win their support as well. The Chola kings, for instance, often attempted to claim divine support and proclaim their own power and status by building splendid temples that were adorned with stone and metal sculpture to recreate the visions of these popular saints who sang in the language of the people. These kings also introduced the singing of Tamil Shaiva hymns in the temples under royal patronage, taking the initiative to collect and organize them into a text Tevaram. Further, inscriptional evidence from around 945 suggests that the Chola ruler Parantaka I had consecrated metal images of Akbar, Sambinder and Sundarar in a Shiva temple. These were carried in processions during the festivals of these saints. Fic. 6.5 An image of Shiva is Nataraj. Discuss. Why do you think kings were interested in proclaiming their connections with bhaktas? 3. The Virishava tradition in Karnataka. The 12th century witnessed the emergence of a new movement in Karnataka, led by a Brahmana named Basavanna 1106-68, who was initially a Jaina and a minister in the court of a Chalukya king. His followers were known as Virishavas, heroes of Shiva, or Lingaites, wearers of the Linga. Lingaites continue to be an important community in the region to date. They worship Shiva in his manifestation as a Linga, and men usually wear a small Linga in a silver case on a loop strung over the left shoulder. Those who are revered include the Jangama or wandering monks. Lingaites believe that on death the devotee will be united with Shiva and will not return to this world. Therefore, they do not practice funerary rites such as cremation, prescribed in the Dharma Shastras. Instead, They ceremonially bury their dead. Source 4. Rituals in the real world. Here is a vachana composed by Basvanna. When they see a serpent carved in stone, they pour milk on it. If a real serpent comes, they say, "Kill, kill." To the servant of the god who could eat if served, they say, "Go away, go away." But to the image of the god which cannot eat, they offer dishes of food. Describe Basavanna's attitude towards rituals. How does he attempt to convince the listener? The Lingayites challenge the idea of caste and the pollution attributed to certain groups by Brahmanas. They also questioned the theory of rebirth. These warned them followers amongst those who were marginalized within the Brahmanical social order. The Lingayites also encouraged certain practices disapproved in the Dharmashastras, such as post-puberty marriage and the remarriage of widows. Our understanding of the Virishava tradition is derived from vachanas, literally sayings, composed in Kannada by women and men who joined the movement. New religious developments. This period also witnessed two major developments. On the one hand, many ideas of the Tamil Bhaktas, especially the Vaishnavas, were incorporated within the Sanskritic tradition, culminating in the composition of one of the best-known Puranas, the Bhagavata Purana. Second, we find the development of traditions of Bhakti in Maharashtra in the 13th century. 4. Religious ferment in North India. During the same period, in North India, deities such as Vishnu and Shiva were worshipped in temples, often built with the support of rulers. However, historians have not found evidence of anything resembling the compositions of the Alvas and Nainas till the 14th century. How do we account for this difference? Some historians point out that in North India this was the period when several Rajput states emerged. In most of these states, Brahmanas occupied positions of importance, performing a range of secular and ritual functions. There seems to have been little or no attempt to challenge their position directly. Fiqh. 6.6 Fragment of a page from the Quran, belonging to a manuscript dating to the 8th or 9th century. At the same time, other religious leaders, who did not function within the orthodox Brahmanical framework, were gaining ground. These included the Nats, Georges and Siddhas. Many of them came from artisanal groups, including weavers, who were becoming increasingly important with the development of organized craft production. Demand for such production grew with the emergence of new urban centers and long-distance trade with Central Asia and West Asia. Many of these new religious leaders questioned the authority of the Vedas and expressed themselves in languages spoken by ordinary people, which developed over centuries into the ones used today. However, in spite of their popularity, these religious leaders were not in a position to win the support of the ruling elites. A new element in this situation was the coming of the Turks, which culminated in the establishment of the Delhi Sultanate 13th century. This undermined the power of many of the Rajput states and the Brahmanas who were associated with these kingdoms. This was accompanied by marked changes in the realm of culture and religion. The coming of the Sufis, section 6, was a significant part of these developments. 5. New strands in the fabric Islamic traditions. Just as the regions within the subcontinent were not isolated from one another, so too, contact with lands beyond the seas and mountains had existed for millennia. Arab merchants, for instance, frequented ports along the western coast in the first millennium CE, while Central Asian peoples settled in the northwestern parts of the subcontinent during the same period. From the 7th century, with the advent of Islam, these regions became part of what is often termed the Islamic world. 5.1 Fates of rulers and subjects. One axis of understanding the significance of these connections that is frequently adopted is to focus on the religions of ruling elites. In 711, an Arab general named Muhammad Qasim conquered Sindh, which became part of the Caliph's domain. Later, c. 13th century, the Turks and Afghans established the Delhi Sultanate. This was followed by the formation of sultanates in the Deccan and other parts of the subcontinent. Islam was an acknowledged religion of rulers in several areas. This continued with the establishment of the Mughal Empire in the 16th century as well as in many of the regional states that emerged in the 18th century. Theoretically, Muslim rulers were to be guided by the ulema, who were expected to ensure that they ruled according to the Sharia. Clearly, the situation was complicated in the subcontinent, where there were populations that did not subscribe to Islam. It is in this context that the category of the zimmi, meaning protected, derived from the Arabic word zimma, protection, developed for peoples who followed revealed scriptures, such as the Jews and Christians, and lived under Muslim rulership. They paid a tax called jizya and gained the right to be protected by Muslims. In India, this status was extended to Hindus as well. As you will see, Chapter 9, rulers such as the Mughals came to regard themselves as emperors of not just Muslims but of all peoples. Ulema, plural of alim, or one who knows, are scholars of Islamic studies. As preservers of this tradition, they perform various religious, juridical and teaching functions. Sharia. The Sharia is the law governing the Muslim community. It is based on the Quran and the Hadith, traditions of the Prophet, including a record of his remembered words and deeds. With the expansion of Islamic rule outside Arabia, in areas where customs and traditions were different, qiyas, reasoning by analogy, and ijma, consensus of the community, were recognized as two other sources of legislation. Thus, the Sharia evolved from the Quran, Hadith, qiyas and ijma. In effect, rulers often adopted a fairly flexible policy towards their subjects. For instance, several rulers gave land endowments and granted tax exemptions to Hindu, Jaina, Zoroastrian, Christian and Jewish religious institutions and also expressed respect and devotion towards non-Muslim religious leaders. These grants were made by several Mughal rulers, including Akbar and Aurangzeb. Fiqh 6.7a Mughal painting depicting Emperor Jahangir with a jogi. Source 5. A church in Khambat. This is an excerpt from a Farman imperial order, issued by Akbar in 1598. Whereas it reached our eminent and holy notice that the Padras fathers of the Holy Society of Jesus wished to build a house of prayer church in the city of Khambat, in Gujarat. Therefore, an exalted mandate is being issued that the dignitaries of the city of Khambat should in no case stand in their way but should allow them to build a church so that they may engage themselves in their own worship. It is necessary that the order of the emperor should be obeyed in every way. Who were the people from whom Akbar anticipated opposition to his order? Source 6. Reverence for the Jogi. Here is an excerpt from a letter written by Aurangzeb to a Jogi in 1661-62. The possessor of the sublime station, Shiv Murat, Guru Anand Nath Jio. May your reverence remain in peace and happiness ever under the protection of Shri Shiv Jio. A piece of cloth for the cloak and a sum of 25 rupees which have been sent as an offering will reach your reverence. Your reverence may write to us whenever there is any service which can be rendered by us. Identify the deity worshipped by the Jogi. Describe the attitude of the emperor towards the Jogi. 5.2 The popular practice of Islam. The developments that followed the coming of Islam were not confined to ruling elites. In fact, they permeated far and wide through the subcontinent, amongst different social strata, peasants, artisans, warriors, merchants, to name a few. All those who adopted Islam accepted, in principle, the 5 pillars of the faith. That there is one God, Allah, and Prophet Muhammad is his messenger, Shahada. Offering prayers 5 times a day, namaz salat. Giving alms zakat. Fasting during the month of Ramzan, Sawm. And performing the pilgrimage to Makkah, Hajj. Fiqh. 6.88 Khojaki manuscript. The Ginan were transmitted orally before being recorded in the Khojaki script that was derived from the local lander clipped, mercantile script. Used by the linguistically diverse community of Khojas in the Punjab, Sindh and Gujarat. However, these universal features were often overlaid with diversities in practice derived from sectarian affiliations, Sunni, Shia, and the influence of local customary practices of converts from different social milieus. For example, the Khojas, a branch of the Ismailis Asia sect, developed new modes of communication, disseminating ideas derived from the Quran through indigenous literary genres. These included the Ginan, derived from the Sanskrit Janana, meaning knowledge, devotional poems in Punjabi, Multani, Sindhi, Kachchi, Hindi and Gujarati, sung in special ragas during daily prayer meetings. Elsewhere, Arab Muslim traders who settled along the Malabar coast, Kerala, adopted the local language, Malayalam. They also adopted local customs such as matriliny, chapter 3, and matrilocal residence. Matrilocal residence is a practice where women after marriage remain in their natal home with their children and the husbands may come to stay with them. The complex blend of a universal faith with local traditions is perhaps best exemplified in the architecture of mosques. Some architectural features of mosques are universal, such as their orientation towards Makkah, evident in the placement of the mihrab prayer niche, and the minbar pulpit. However, there are several features that show variations, such as roofs and building materials. See Fix 6.9, 6.10 and 6.11. Fiqh 6.9 A mosque in Kerala, c. 13th century. Note the shikhara-like roof. Fiqh 6.10 Atia Mosque, Mymensingh district, Bangladesh, built with brick, 1609. 5.3 Names for communities. We often take the terms Hindu and Muslim for granted, as labels for religious communities. Yet, these terms did not gain currency for a very long time. Historians who have studied Sanskrit texts and inscriptions dating between the 8th and 14th centuries point out that the term Musalman or Muslim was virtually never used. Instead, people were occasionally identified in terms of the region from which they came. So, the Turkish rulers were designated as Turushka. Taika were people from Tajikistan and Parashika were people from Persia. Sometimes, terms used for other peoples were applied to the new migrants. For instance, the Turks and Afghans were referred to as Shakas, chapters 2 and 3. And Yavanas, a term used for Greeks. Fiqh 6.11 The Shah Hamadan Mosque in Srinagar, on the banks of the Jhelum, is often regarded as the jewel in the crown of all the existing mosques of Kashmir. Built in 1395, it is one of the best examples of Kashmiri wooden architecture. Notice the spire and the beautifully carved eaves. It is decorated with papier-mâché. A more general term for these migrant communities was Malchha, indicating that they did not observe the norms of caste society and spoke languages that were not derived from Sanskrit. Such terms sometimes had a derogatory connotation, but they rarely denoted a distinct religious community of Muslims in opposition to Hindus. And as we saw chapter 5, the term Hindu was used in a variety of ways, not necessarily restricted to a religious connotation. Discuss. Find out more about the architecture of mosques in your village or town. What are the materials used to build mosques? Are these locally available? Are there any distinctive architectural features? 6. The growth of Sufism. In the early centuries of Islam, a group of religious-minded people called Sufis turned to asceticism and mysticism in protest against the growing materialism of the caliphate as a religious and political institution. They were critical of the dogmatic definitions and scholastic methods of interpreting the Quran and Sunnah traditions of the Prophet, adopted by theologians. Instead, they laid emphasis on seeking salvation through intense devotion and love for God by following His commands, and by following the example of the Prophet Muhammad, whom they regarded as a perfect human being. The Sufis thus sought an interpretation of the Quran on the basis of their personal experience. 6.1 Khanqahs and Silsilas. By the 11th century, Sufism evolved into a well-developed movement with a body of literature on Quranic studies and Sufi practices. Institutionally, the Sufis began to organize communities around the hospice or Khanqah Persian, controlled by a teaching master known as Sheikh in Arabic, Pir or Murshid in Persian. He enrolled disciples, Murids, and appointed a successor Khalifa. He established rules for spiritual conduct and interaction between inmates as well as between laypersons and the master. Sufi silsilas began to crystallize in different parts of the Islamic world around the 12th century. The word silsila literally means a chain, signifying a continuous link between master and disciple, stretching as an unbroken spiritual genealogy to the Prophet Muhammad. It was through this channel that spiritual power and blessings were transmitted to devotees. Special rituals of initiation were developed in which initiates took an oath of allegiance, wore a patched garment, and shaved their hair. Sufism and Tasawwuf. Sufism is an English word coined in the 19th century. The word used for Sufism in Islamic texts is Tasawwuf. Historians have understood this term in several ways. According to some scholars, it is derived from Suf, meaning wool, referring to the coarse woolen clothes worn by Sufis. Others derive it from Safa, meaning purity. It may also have been derived from Safa, the platform outside the Prophet's mosque, where a group of close followers assembled to learn about the faith. Names of silsilas. Most Sufi lineages were named after a founding figure. For example, the Qadiri order was named after Sheikh Abdul Qadir Jilani. However, some, like the Chishti order, were named after their place of origin, in this case the town of Chisht in central Afghanistan. When the Sheikh died, his tomb shrine Dargah, a Persian term meaning cot, became the center of devotion for his followers. This encouraged the practice of pilgrimage or ziyarah to his grave, particularly on his death anniversary or uwaris or marriage, signifying the union of his soul with God. This was because people believed that in death saints were united with God, and were thus closer to Him than when living. People sought their blessings to attain material and spiritual benefits. Thus evolved the cult of the Sheikh revered as Wali. Wali plural Awliya. A friend of God was a Sufi who claimed proximity to Allah, acquiring His grace barakat, to perform miracles karamat. Discuss. Are there any khanqahs or dargahs in your town or village? Find out when these were built, and what are the activities associated with them. Are there other places where religious men and women meet or live? 6.2 Outside the Khanqah. Some mystics initiated movements based on a radical interpretation of Sufi ideals. Many scorned the Khanqah and took to mendicancy and observed celibacy. They ignored rituals and observed extreme forms of asceticism. They were known by different names: Kalandars, Madaris, Malangs, Hadaris, etc. Because of their deliberate defiance of the Sharia, they were often referred to as Bisharia, in contrast to the Basharia Sufis who complied with it. 7. The Chishtis in the subcontinent. Of the groups of Sufis who migrated to India in the late 12th century, the Chishtis were the most influential. This was because they adapted successfully to the local environment and adopted several features of Indian devotional traditions. 7.1 Life in the Chishti Khanqa. The Khanqa was the center of social life. We know about Sheikh Nizamuddin's hospice c. 14th century. On the banks of the river Yamuna in Ghiaspur, on the outskirts of what was then the city of Delhi. It comprised several small rooms and a big hall, Jama Khana, where the inmates and visitors lived and prayed. The inmates included family members of the Sheikh, his attendants and disciples. The Sheikh lived in a small room on the roof of the hall where he met visitors in the morning and evening. A veranda surrounded the courtyard, and a boundary wall ran around the complex. On one occasion, fearing a Mongol invasion, people from the neighboring areas flocked into the Khanqa to seek refuge. There was an open kitchen, langa, run on few to unasked for charity. From morning till late night, people from all walks of life, soldiers, slaves, singers, merchants, poets, travelers, rich and poor, Hindu Georges yogi, and Kalandars came seeking discipleship, amulets for healing, and the intercession of the Sheikh in various matters. Other visitors included poets such as Amir Hassan Sizi and Amir Khusrau and the court historian Ziauddin Barani, all of whom wrote about the Sheikh. Practices that were adopted, including bowing before the Sheikh, offering water to visitors, shaving the heads of initiates, and yogic exercises, represented attempts to assimilate local traditions. The story of Data Ganj Baksh. In 1039, Abu Hassan al-Hajwiri, a native of Hajwir near Ghazni in Afghanistan, was forced to cross the Indus as a captive of the invading Turkish army. He settled in Lahore and wrote a book in Persian called the Kashful Majub, Unveiling of the Veiled, to explain the meaning of tasawwuf and those who practiced it, that is, the Sufi. Hajwiri died in 1073 and was buried in Lahore. The grandson of Sultan Mahmud of Ghazni constructed a tomb over his grave, and the stone shrine became a site of pilgrimage for his devotees, especially on his death anniversary. Even today, Hajwiri is revered as Data Ganj Bakshaw, giver who bestows treasures, and his mausoleum is called Data Daba or Court of the Giver. Sheikh Nizamuddin appointed several spiritual successors and deputed them to set up hospices in various parts of the subcontinent. As a result, the teachings, practices and organization of the Chishtis as well as the fame of the Sheikh spread rapidly. This in turn drew pilgrims to his shrine, and also to the shrines of his spiritual ancestors. 7.2 Chishti Devotionalism. Ziyart and Qawwali. Pilgrimage, called ziyart, to tombs of Sufi saints is prevalent all over the Muslim world. This practice is an occasion for seeking the Sufi's spiritual grace, barakat. For more than 7 centuries, people of various creeds, classes and social backgrounds have expressed their devotion at the dargahs of the 5 great Chishti saints. See chart on p.154. Amongst these, the most revered shrine is that of Khwaja Muinuddin, popularly known as Gharib Nawaz, comforter of the poor. The earliest textual references to Khwaja Muinuddin's dargah date to the 14th century. It was evidently popular because of the austerity and piety of its sheikh, the greatness of his spiritual successes, and the patronage of royal visitors. Muhammad bin Tughlaq ruled 1324–51. Was the first sultan to visit the shrine, but the earliest construction to house the tomb was funded in the late 15th century by Sultan Ghiyasuddin Khalji of Malwa. Since the shrine was located on the trade route linking Delhi and Gujarat, it attracted a lot of travelers. Fiqh 6.12 A 17th century painting of Sheikh Nizamuddin Aulia and his disciple Amir Khusrau. Describe how the artist differentiates between the sheikh and his disciple. By the 16th century, the shrine had become very popular. In fact, it was the spirited singing of pilgrims bound for Ajmer that inspired Akbar to visit the tomb. He went there 14 times, sometimes 2 or 3 times a year, to seek blessings for new conquests, fulfillment of vows, and the birth of sons. He maintained this tradition until 1580. Each of these visits was celebrated by generous gifts, which were recorded in imperial documents. For example, in 1568 he offered a huge cauldron deck to facilitate cooking for pilgrims. He also had a mosque constructed within the compound of the Dargah. Fiqh 6.13 Shaks greeting the Mughal Emperor Jahangir on his pilgrimage to Ajmer. Painting by an artist named Manohar. C.1615. Find his signature on the painting. Source 6. The Pilgrimage of the Mughal Princess Jahanara. 1643. The following is an excerpt from Jahanara's biography of Sheikh Muinuddin Chishti, titled Munis al-Arwah, the Confidant of Spirits. After praising the one God, the slowly Fakira, humble soul, Jahanara, went from the capital Agra in the company of my great father Emperor Shah Jahan towards the pure region of incomparable Ajmer. I was committed to this idea that every day in every station I would perform 2 cycles of optional prayer for several days. I did not sleep on a leopard skin at night. I did not extend my feet in the direction of the blessed sanctuary of the revered saving master, and I did not turn my back towards him. I passed the days beneath the trees. On Thursday, the 4th of the blessed month of Ramzan, I attained the happiness of pilgrimage to the illuminated and the perfumed tomb. With an hour of daylight remaining, I went to the holy sanctuary and rubbed my pale face with the dust of that threshold. From the doorway to the blessed tomb I went barefoot, kissing the ground. Having entered the dome, I went around the light-filled tomb of my master 7 times. Finally, with my own hand I put the finest quality of attar on the perfumed tomb of the revered one, and having taken off the rose scarf that I had on my head, I placed it on the top of the blessed tomb. What are the gestures that Jahanara records to indicate her devotion to the Sheikh? How does she suggest that the Dargah was a special place? Also part of Ziyart is the use of music and dance, including mystical chants performed by specially trained musicians or qawwals to evoke divine ecstasy. The Sufis remember God either by reciting the zikr, the divine names, or evoking his presence through sama, literally, audition, or performance of mystical music. Sama was integral to the Chishtis and exemplified interaction with indigenous devotional traditions. The lamp of the entire land. Each Sufi shrine was associated with distinctive features. This is what an 18th century visitor from the Deccan, Dargah Quli Khan, wrote about the shrine of Nasiruddin Chirag-i Delhi in his Murakka-i Delhi album of Delhi. The Sheikh in the grave is not the lamp of Delhi but of the entire country. People turn up there in crowds, particularly on Sunday. In the month of Diwali, the entire population of Delhi visits it and stays in tents around the spring tank for days. They take baths to obtain cures from chronic diseases. Muslims and Hindus pay visits in the same spirit. From morning till evening, people come and also make themselves busy in merrymaking in the shade of the trees. Amir Khusrau in the call. Amir Khusrau 1253-1325, the great poet, musician and disciple of Sheikh Nizamuddin Aulia, gave a unique form to the Chishti Sama by introducing the call. Arabic word meaning saying, a hymn sung at the opening or closing of Qawwali. This was followed by Sufi poetry in Persian, Hindavi or Urdu, and sometimes using words from all of these languages. Qawwals, those who sing these songs at the shrine of Sheikh Nizamuddin Aulia, always start their recital with the call. Today Qawwali is performed in shrines all over the subcontinent. Fiqh 6.14 Qawwali at the Dargah of Nizamuddin Aulia. 7.3 Languages and communication. It was not just in Sama that the Chishtis adopted local languages. In Delhi, those associated with the Chishti Silsila conversed in Hindavi, the language of the people. Other Sufis such as Baba Farad compose verses in the local language, which were incorporated in the Guru Granth Sahib. Yet others compose long poems or masnavis to express ideas of divine love using human love as an allegory. For example, the Prem Akhyan love story. Padmavat, composed by Malik Muhammad Jayasi, revolved around the romance of Padmini and Ratansan, the king of Chitta. Their trials were symbolic of the soul's journey to the divine. Such poetic compositions were often recited in hospices, usually during Sama. A different genre of Sufi poetry was composed in and around the town of Bijapur, Karnataka. These were short poems in Dekhani, a variant of Urdu, attributed to Chishti Sufis who lived in this region during the 17th and 18th centuries. These poems were probably sung by women while performing household chores like grinding grain and spinning. Other compositions were in the form of lurinima or lullabies and shadinima or wedding songs. It is likely that the Sufis of this region were inspired by the pre-existing Bhakti tradition of the Kannada Vachanas of the Lingaites and the Marathi Abhangs of the Sants of Pindarpur. It is through this medium that Islam gradually gained a place in the villages of the Deccan. Source 8. Charkhanama. A song set to the rhythm of the spinning wheel. As you take the cotton, you do zikrai jali. As you separate the cotton, you should do zikrai kalbi. And as you spool the thread, you should do zikrai aini. Zikr should be uttered from the stomach through the chest and threaded through the throat. The threads of breath should be counted one by one, O sister, up to 24,000. Do this day and night, and offer this to your peer as a gift. In what ways are the ideas and modes of expression used in this song similar to or different from those used by Jahanara to describe Hazrat? Source 7. 7.4 Sufis in the state. A major feature of the Chishti tradition was austerity, including maintaining a distance from worldly power. However, this was by no means a situation of absolute isolation from political power. The Sufis accepted unsolicited grants and donations from the political elites. The sultans in turn set up charitable trusts (Awqaf) as endowments for hospices and granted tax-free land (Inam). The Chishtis accepted donations in cash and kind. Rather than accumulate donations, they preferred to use these fully on immediate requirements such as food, clothes, living quarters and ritual necessities such as sama. All this enhanced the moral authority of the shaks, which in turn attracted people from all walks of life. Further, their piety and scholarship, and people's belief in their miraculous powers made Sufis popular among the masses, whose support kings wished to secure. Kings did not simply need to demonstrate their association with Sufis. They also required legitimation from them. When the Turks set up the Delhi Sultanate, they resisted the insistence of the ulema on imposing Sharia as state law because they anticipated opposition from their subjects, the majority of whom were non-Muslims. The sultans then sought out the Sufis, who derived their authority directly from God and did not depend on jurists to interpret the Sharia. Besides, it was believed that the awliya could intercede with God in order to improve the material and spiritual conditions of ordinary human beings. This explains why kings often wanted their tombs to be in the vicinity of Sufi shrines and hospices. Sufis and the state. Other Sufis such as the Suravati under the Delhi Sultans and the Naqshbandi under the Mughals were also associated with the state. However, the modes of their association were not the same as those of the Chishtis. In some cases, Sufis accepted courtly offices. However, there were instances of conflict between the sultans and the Sufis. To assert their authority, both expected that certain rituals be performed such as prostration and kissing of the feet. Occasionally the Sufi sheikh was addressed with high-sounding titles. For example, the disciples of Nizamuddin Auliya addressed him as Sultan ul Mashak, literally, Sultan amongst shaks. Discuss. What are the potential sources of conflict in the relationship between religious and political leaders? Source 9. Declining a royal gift. This excerpt from a Sufi text describes the proceedings at Sheikh Nizamuddin Auliya's hospice in 1313. I, the author, Amir Hassan Sizi, had the good fortune of kissing his Sheikh Nizamuddin Auliya's feet. At this time a local ruler had sent him the deed of ownership to 2 gardens and much land, along with the provisions and tools for their maintenance. The ruler had also made it clear that he was relinquishing all his rights to both the gardens and land. The master had not accepted that gift. Instead, he had lamented, "What have I to do with gardens and fields and lands? None of our spiritual masters had engaged in such activity." Then he told an appropriate story. Sultan Ghiyasuddin, who at that time was still known as Ulf Khan, came to visit Sheikh Fariduddin and offered some money and ownership deeds for 4 villages to the Sheikh, the money being for the benefit of the dervishist Sufis and the land for his use. Smiling, Sheikh al-Islam Fariduddin said, "Give me the money. I will dispense it to the dervishes. But as for those land deeds, keep them. There are many who long for them. Give them away to such persons." What aspects of the relationship between the Sufis and the state do you think are best illustrated in this account? What does the account tell us about the modes of communication between the Sheikh and his disciples? Fiqh 6.15 The Dargah of Sheikh Salim Chishti, a direct descendant of Baba Ferret. Constructed in Fatehpur Sikri, Akbar's capital, symbolized the bond between the Chishtis and the Mughal state. 8. New devotional paths, dialogue and descent in northern India. Many poet saints engaged in explicit and implicit dialogue with these new social situations, ideas and institutions. Let us now see how this dialogue found expression. We focus here on 3 of the most influential figures of the time. 8.1 Weaving a divine fabric. Kabir. Kabir, c. 14th-15th centuries, is perhaps one of the most outstanding examples of a poet saint who emerged within this context. Historians have painstakingly tried to reconstruct his life and times through a study of compositions attributed to him as well as later hagiographies. Such exercises have proved to be challenging on a number of counts. Verses ascribed to Kabir have been compiled in 3 distinct but overlapping traditions. The Kabir Bijak is preserved by the Kabirpant, the path or sect of Kabir, in Varanasi and elsewhere in Uttar Pradesh. The Kabir Granthawali is associated with the Dadupant in Rajasthan, and many of his compositions are found in the Adi Granth Sahib, see section 8.2. All these manuscript compilations were made long after the death of Kabir. By the 19th century, anthologies of verses attributed to him circulated in print in regions as far apart as Bengal, Gujarat, and Maharashtra. Kabir's poems have survived in several languages and dialects. And some are composed in the special language of Nirguna poets, the Sant Bhasha. Others, known as Ulat Bansi, upside-down sayings, are written in a form in which everyday meanings are inverted. These hint at the difficulties of capturing the nature of the ultimate reality in words. Expressions such as, the lotus which blooms without flower, or the fire raging in the ocean, convey a sense of Kabir's mystical experiences. Source 10. The One Lord. Here is a composition attributed to Kabir. Tell me, brother, how can there be no one Lord of the world but true? Who led you so astray? God is called by many names. Names like Allah, Ram, Kareem, Keshav, Hari, and Hazrat. Gold may be shaped into rings and bangles. Isn't it gold all the same? Distinctions are only words we invent. Kabir says they are both mistaken. Neither can find the only Ram. One kills the goat, the other cows. They waste their lives in disputation. What is Kabir's argument against the distinction made between gods of different communities? Also striking is the range of traditions Kabir drew on to describe the ultimate reality. These include Islam. He described the ultimate reality as Allah, Khuda, Hazrat, and Peer. He also used terms drawn from Vedantic traditions: Alak, the unseen, Nirakar, formless Brahman, Atman, etc. Other terms with mystical connotations such as Shabda, sound, or Shunya, emptiness, were drawn from yogic traditions. Diverse and sometimes conflicting ideas are expressed in these poems. Some poems draw on Islamic ideas and use monotheism and iconoclasm to attack Hindu polytheism and idol worship. Others use the Sufi concept of zikr and ishq, love, to express the Hindu practice of Nam Simran, remembrance of God's name. Were all these composed by Kabir? We may never be able to tell with certainty, although scholars have tried to analyze the language, style, and content to establish which verses could be Kabir's. What this rich corpus of verses also signifies is that Kabir was and is to the present a source of inspiration for those who question entrenched religious and social institutions, ideas, and practices in their search for the divine. Just as Kabir's ideas probably crystallized through dialogue and debate, explicit or implicit. With the traditions of Sufis and yogis in the region of Awadh, part of present-day Uttar Pradesh, his legacy was claimed by several groups, who remembered him and continue to do so. This is most evident in later debates about whether he was a Hindu or a Muslim by birth, debates that are reflected in hagiographies. Many of these were composed from the 17th century onwards, about 200 years after Kabir's lifetime. Fiqh. 6.16 Roadside musicians. A 17th century Mughal painting. It is likely that the compositions of the Sants were sung by such musicians. Hagiographies within the Vaishnava tradition attempted to suggest that he was born a Hindu. Kabirdas. Kabir itself is an Arabic word meaning great, but was raised by a poor Muslim family belonging to the community of weavers or julahas, who were relatively recent converts to Islam. They also suggested that he was initiated into Bhakti by a guru, perhaps Ramananda. However, the verses attributed to Kabir use the words Guru and Satguru, but do not mention the name of any specific preceptor. Historians have pointed out that it is very difficult to establish that Ramananda and Kabir were contemporaries, without assigning improbably long lives to either or both. So, while traditions linking the two cannot be accepted at face value, they show how important the legacy of Kabir was for later generations. 8.2 Baba Guru Nanak and the Sacred Word. Baba Guru Nanak 1469–1539 was born in a Hindu merchant family in a village called Nankana Sahib near the river Ravi in the predominantly Muslim Punjab. He trained to be an accountant and studied Persian. He was married at a young age, but he spent most of his time among Sufis and Bhaktas. He also traveled widely. The message of Baba Guru Nanak is spelt out in his hymns and teachings. These suggest that he advocated a form of Nirguna Bhakti. He firmly repudiated the external practices of the religions he saw around him. He rejected sacrifices, ritual baths, image worship, austerities in the scriptures of both Hindus and Muslims. For Baba Guru Nanak, the absolute or Rab had no gender or form. He proposed a simple way to connect to the divine by remembering and repeating the divine name, expressing his ideas through hymns called Shabad in Punjabi, the language of the region. Baba Guru Nanak would sing these compositions in various ragas while his attendant Mardana played the rabab. Baba Guru Nanak organized his followers into a community. He set up rules for congregational worship, Sangat, involving collective recitation. He appointed one of his disciples, Angad, to succeed him as the preceptor Guru, and this practice was followed for nearly 200 years. It appears that Baba Guru Nanak did not wish to establish a new religion, but after his death his followers consolidated their own practices and distinguished themselves from both Hindus and Muslims. The fifth preceptor, Guru Arjan, compiled Baba Guru Nanak's hymns along with those of his four successors and other religious poets like Baba Ferid, Ravidas also known as Radas, and Kabir in the Adi Granth Sahib. These hymns, called Gurbani, are composed in various languages. In the late 17th century, the 10th preceptor, Guru Gobind Singh, included the compositions of the 9th Guru, Guru Tegh Bahadur, and the scripture was called the Guru Granth Sahib. Guru Gobind Singh also laid the foundation of the Khalsa Panth, Army of the Pure, and defined its 5 symbols: uncut hair, a dagger, a pair of shorts, a comb and a steel bangle. Under him the community got consolidated as a socio-religious and military force. 8.3 Mirabai, the devotee princess. Mirabai, c. 15th–16th centuries, is perhaps the best known woman poet within the Bhakti tradition. Biographies have been reconstructed primarily from the bhajans attributed to her, which were transmitted orally for centuries. According to these, she was a Rajput princess from Merta in Marwar who was married against her wishes to a prince of the Sisodia clan of Mewar, Rajasthan. She defied her husband and did not submit to the traditional role of wife and mother, instead recognizing Krishna, the avatar of Vishnu, as her lover. Her in-laws tried to poison her, but she escaped from the palace to live as a wandering singer composing songs that are characterized by intense expressions of emotion. Fic. 6.17 A 15th century stone sculpture, Tamil Nadu, depicting Krishna playing the flute, a form of the deity worshipped by Mirabai. Source 11. Love for the Lord. This is part of a song attributed to Mirabai. I will build a funeral pyre of sandalwood and aloe. Light it by your own hand. When I am burned away to cinders, smear this ash upon your limbs. Let flame be lost in flame. In another verse, she sings, what can Muir's ruler do to me? If God is angry, all is lost. But what can the Rana do? What does this indicate about Mirabai's attitude towards the king? According to some traditions, her preceptor was Radas, a leather worker. This would indicate her defiance of the norms of caste society. After rejecting the comforts of her husband's palace, she is supposed to have donned the white robes of a widow or the saffron robe of the renouncer. Although Mirabai did not attract a sect or group of followers, she has been recognized as a source of inspiration for centuries. Her songs continue to be sung by women and men, especially those who are poor and considered low caste, in Gujarat and Rajasthan. Discuss. Why do you think the traditions of Kabir, Baba Guru Nanak and Mirabai remain significant in the 21st century? 9. Reconstructing histories of religious traditions. We have seen that historians draw on a variety of sources to reconstruct histories of religious traditions. These include sculpture, architecture, stories about religious precepts, compositions attributed to women and men engaged in the quest of understanding the nature of the divine. As we have seen in chapters 1 and 4, sculpture and architecture can only be understood if we have a grasp of the context, the ideas, beliefs and practices of those who produced and used these images and buildings. What about textual traditions regarding religious beliefs? If you return to the sources in this chapter, you will notice that they include a wide variety, written in several different languages and styles. They range from the apparently simple, direct language of the Vachanas of Basvanna to the ornate Persian of the Farman of the Mughal emperors. Understanding each type of text requires different skills. Apart from a familiarity with several languages, the historian has to be aware of the subtle variations in style that characterize each genre. Shankaradeva. In the late 15th century, Shankaradeva emerged as one of the leading proponents of Vaishnavism in Assam. His teachings, often known as the Bhagavati Dharma because they were based on the Bhagavad Gita and the Bhagavata Purana, focused on absolute surrender to the supreme deity, in this case Vishnu. He emphasized the need for Nam Kirtan, recitation of the names of the Lord in satsanga or congregations of pious devotees. He also encouraged the establishment of satra or monasteries for the transmission of spiritual knowledge, and namghar or prayer halls. Many of these institutions and practices continue to flourish in the region. His major compositions include the Kirtana Ghosha. Varieties of sources used to reconstruct the history of Sufi traditions. A wide range of texts were produced in and around Sufi khanqahs. These included 1. Treatises or manuals dealing with Sufi thought and practices. The Kashf-ul Majoob of Ali bin Usman Hajwiri, died c. 1071, is an example of this genre. It enables historians to see how traditions outside the subcontinent influenced Sufi thought in India. 2. Malfuzat, literally uttered conversations of Sufi saints. An early text on Malfuzat is the Fawad al-Fuad, a collection of conversations of Sheikh Nizamuddin Auliya, compiled by Amir Hassan Sizi Dehlavi, a noted Persian poet. Source 9 contains an excerpt from this text. Malfuzats were compiled by different Sufi silsilas with the permission of the sheikhs. These had obvious didactic purposes. Several examples have been found from different parts of the subcontinent, including the Deccan. They were compiled over several centuries. 3. Maktubat, literally written collections of letters. Letters written by Sufi masters, addressed to their disciples and associates. While these tell us about the sheikh's experience of religious truth that he wanted to share with others, they also reflect the life conditions of the recipients and our responses to their aspirations and difficulties, both spiritual and mundane. The letters, known as Maktubat-i-Imam Rabbani, of the noted 17th century Naqshbandi Sheikh Ahmad Sirindi d.1624, whose ideology is often contrasted with the liberal and non-sectarian views of Akbar, are amongst those most frequently discussed by scholars. 4. Tazkiras literally, to mention and memorialize. Biographical accounts of saints. The 14th century Siyar-ul Awliya of Mukh Kirmani was the first Sufi tazkira written in India. It dealt principally with the Chishti saints. The most famous tazkira is the Akbar-ul-Akhyar of Abdul Haq Muhaddis Dehlavi g. 1642. The authors of the tazkiras often sought to establish the precedence of their own orders and glorify their spiritual genealogies. Many details are often implausible, full of elements of the fantastic. Still, they are of great value for historians and help them to understand more fully the nature of the tradition. Remember that each of the traditions we have been considering in this chapter generated a wide range of textual and oral modes of communication, some of which have been preserved, many of which have been modified in the process of transmission, and others are probably lost forever. Virtually all these religious traditions continue to flourish to date. This continuity has certain advantages for historians as it allows them to compare contemporary practices with those described in textual traditions or shown in old paintings and to trace changes. At the same time, because these traditions are part of people's lived beliefs and practices, there is often a lack of acceptance of the possibility that these may have changed over time. The challenge for historians is to undertake such investigations with sensitivity, while at the same time recognizing that religious traditions, like other traditions, are dynamic and change over time.